Having almost nothing to do for long stretches of time recently has me interrogating my media consumption habits a little. The main thing I've noticed is that I generally find myself drifting between mediums, mostly music and video games, and during my video game periods over the last couple of weeks, I've grown a deep affection for itch.io. It's like Steam, except you don't get the same AAA games thrown in your face all the time, it's not a complete nightmare to explore and navigate, and the people who upload their work, they're good to sell it on their own terms rather than bow to the whims of a greedy company. And as it becomes more and more clear how unfathomably normalized labor exploitation is in the AAA world, and as the games get more and more expensive and have to continually water themselves down to widen their appeal and sell as many copies as possible, the more I realize that I'll probably find myself moving almost entirely to the indie scene in the next couple of years. So, since we're all stuck here, I guess, I've been powering through a ton of interesting games recently, and I decided to create a small list of highlights from what I've been able to find, generally focusing on stuff that will serve as a nice escapist distraction from, everything going on right now. My hope with this video is not only that I can maybe share some more specific visions than AAA games allow with people who may vibe to them, but to encourage you to dig through itch.io yourself. Literally, set aside a few hours in the afternoon and just binge free or cheap games that even remotely catch your attention. It's a really fun place to look around. And of course, links to all these games are in the description. I'm going to link itch and Steam if a game is available on both, but I'd really recommend you buy these games on itch, even if just to help the devs sell them on their own terms. I'm going to start this off with 3 pretty definitive entries into my video game taste canon. Only one of them was a new discovery for me in all these binge sessions I've had in the past few weeks, but they all fit nicely into what kinds of games I'm looking for in this. The first is Eastshade, which is also probably just the strongest recommendation I can give. This one is already covered in its own video, but the short of it is that it's a non-violent open-world RPG centered around painting, and it has some of the best atmosphere and, full stop, the best open-world design I've ever experienced in a video game. It is deeply comforting, incredibly memorable, and I hope it kickstarts its own subgenre, because I really need more proper RPGs that just happen to have no combat. Eastshade took me 9 hours to beat and is currently available for $25. It's the most expensive game I'm going to talk about today, but it is absolutely worth it. But if you're not in an open world mood and are maybe hankering for a story-driven single-player campaign, you owe it to yourself to play Wandersong. It's another game with no combat and explores a lack of combat both by picking apart the ways that games try to engage us and by picking apart our assumptions about the role of fictional characters who wield violence. But it's also not really that simple because it's also about the psychology of optimism, I think, and the ultimate uselessness of pessimism and how both of those apply to our acceptance or rejection of dominant narratives, and the anime power of friendship. I really need to make an actual video on this game and get it out of my system, but basically this is probably literally my favorite game ever made, and I just want more people to know about it. Wandersong also took me about 9 hours to beat and is available for $18. Play it. Play Wandersong. Play Wandersong. Play Wandersong. The last of this trio is Anodyne 2, and I don't know what this game is. This was the game that was new to me in the past couple of weeks, and it grabbed me harder than any of my other new discoveries. This is another one I think I just need to make a video about, but first I really need to let it sit with me, because even after finishing it, I don't know where to start when explaining it. It's part lo-fi 3D exploration platforming game and part 2D Zelda-like, and I really don't want to say too much specific about it because I went into it knowing nothing, and it constantly surprised me all the way through, in little moments of humor or humanity, in unbelievably creative and playful game design, and incredibly huge themes that hit me really, really hard. Every time I thought I had this game figured out, it completely pulled the rug out from under me, and if that sounds like your thing, this will really be your thing. Anodyne 2 took me about 8 hours to beat and is available for $20. It's also worth mentioning that there is a lot of potential post-game content if you're up for it, and despite the 2 in the title, the devs themselves say that there is no need to play the original Anodyne in order to understand and enjoy this one. So those three games, price and lengthwise, are on the higher end of the general indie spectrum, and it's entirely possible you don't have the money or time to commit to them. To compensate for this, I prepared a kind of lightning round of some highlights of the many free games I've been trying out in the past whatever. None of these should take more than an hour to complete, so you've really got nothing to lose. Happy's Humble Burger Barn is a short little spooky story set in a fast food graveyard shift. I work fast food myself and I loathe it as much as the next person, but I'm always strangely drawn to these simplified, highly video gamey abstractions of food preparation and customer service. The spooky stuff is fun too, and it seems to imply a much bigger universe by the end, but for some reason I just kind of mostly latched on to the very, very simple mechanics and the general hours that no one else wants to work atmosphere. Storyseeker is a half-hour-ish exploration game where you walk all around a giant map where fallen civilizations definitely outnumber the living ones. I really enjoyed slowly getting to grips with the map in this game, which isn't that large, but still manages to convey the feeling of a complete world, especially with the visual variety. Also, it's just one of those games that feels like you were plonked into the middle of a giant painting and left to wander around, and that's a cool feeling. Super Lesbian Animal RPG isn't out yet, but there's a short demo that's enough to make me really look forward to whenever it comes out. It's really cute. I love how it's equal parts Tumblr personas, RPG fantasy stuff, and total Lisa Frank whimsy. And the music is pretty jammin'. And you can kiss your girlfriend to gain advantages in combat. That alone sells me on this game, really. Aaaarrrrgggghhhh is a micro-sized adventure game that can be finished in well under 10 minutes, but it still managed to stick with me. It was made by a few students over the course of a semester, none of whom had any kind of extensive game design experience, and it kind of reminded me of when I would design little games on pieces of paper as a kid. I don't know, something about the simplicity charmed me. A Bewitching Revoltion is an hour-long adventure-y type game where you play as a communist witch labor agitator equipping the people of a small, semi-cyberpunk district with the knowledge and tools they need to overthrow the system. Not only is it super fun getting to know the small map and slowly watching it transform from a capitalist hellhole to a speck of hope for the city and the world, but it's also, I don't know, it just feels especially relevant right now. Can't imagine why. And finally, have a bite-sized half-hour visual novel in the form of One Night Hot Springs, a cute, intimate, and very personal feeling story about a Japanese trans girl visiting the hot springs with her gal friends for the first time. If there's anything that particularly jumped out at me about this story besides the pleasant hum of it all, it's one of the gal friends who accepts the protagonist for who she is, but doesn't know the lingo and says some occasionally rude or uncomfortable things by accident. But when the protagonist corrects her, she genuinely learns, and it feels really natural. It's just a nice reminder that you don't need to be super knowledgeable about gender theory or even all that familiar with queer concepts in general to still have empathy for the experiences of others. So that's what I've got for free games. Here's some mostly more substantial fare that'll cost varying amounts. Sqool was one of the earliest revelations I had during these binges. I used to draw all the time as a kid, but I stopped at some point, which is probably traceable to a growing self-shame over my total lack of ability as a visual thinker. But Sqool not only got me to sit down and actually draw again, it actually got me to make drawings that I was genuinely happy with. I'm terrible at finishing creative projects in general, but sitting down with Sqool and pumping out a few drawings, however rudimentary, gave me this really satisfying arc of conceptualizing and outlining and detailing and revising and finishing that I quickly realized I hadn't properly felt since I was a kid. For how rudimentary the game is, and for how often the literally randomly generated grade screwed me over and made me repeat an assignment, it proved to be terrifyingly good at getting me to put creative work in. The super limited toolset, especially the colors, actually make the game a good deal more approachable than having infinite tools because you're never overwhelmed by your options, and the prompts are often really fun too, of course. If you want a slightly more thorough look at this game, I'd recommend the Errant Signal Blips episode where he talks about it, taking a bit more of a bird's eye view, but for this video I wanted to focus more on my personal experience. Sqool took me 2 hours to beat and is available for $12, and it is worth noting that you can't see every single prompt in one playthrough, not even close. So if you vibe with it, it's very replayable. I I played 2 games around the same time in these binges that I ended up weirdly associating with one another, even though they're both extremely different aside from being 3D platformers. The first of these was Macbat 64, a micro-sized love letter to N64 Rareware games. Moving around as the Bat is a lot of fun due to his Kirby-style repeated jump levitation thing, but the levels are all almost comically tiny and never have more than a few parts to keep track of. It's very small and simple and short, but I recommend it anyway just because as it goes on, it actually proves to have some really fun surprises under its sleeve as it begins to pay homage to more than just Banjo-Kazooie and the like. It didn't blow me away, but it took me off guard enough to make it stick in my mind amongst all the other games I played. Macbat 64 can be beaten, including some pretty neat post-game stuff, in under an hour. The base price is $2, but it's currently free, so maybe I should have put it with the other free games, but I'm too lazy to rearrange the script, and also I wanted to segue this into Newt One, so let's talk about Newt One. I hope that's okay. Newt One is a colorful, kinda abstracted 3D platformer where you color in a black and white world by touching the grayed out parts of the level. There's no combat, no lives, no time limit, and none of the platforming is especially complicated. It's extremely relaxing and generally low stakes as a result, playing more like a kid's game than anything else, especially with the lighthearted tone and the simple, fantastical story about bringing color and music back to the land. It looks really nice and the music is lovely. The control took a bit of adjusting to. It's not like ice physics exactly, but your momentum is preserved longer than in most 3D platformers, which gives the feeling less of walking and more of gliding. I actually ended up really liking that once I got to grips with it. It makes it feel like graceful and flowing. But the reason why I kept mentally tying it to Macbat 64 is that, while that game reminded me of N64 3D platformers in its overt aesthetic choices and a lot of direct references, Newt One actually replicated this feeling of, like, the magic and romance of moving through a 3D space, a feeling I strongly associate with that strand of game. When I was a kid, I almost never got the chance to play video games unless they were in Flash, and I built up this huge fascination with just the inherent idea of walking through and exploring a full digital world. Obviously, I've played so many games since then that moving around in a 3D space is just second nature to me now. I'm numb to it. But for some reason, Newt One's defiant simplicity and wide-eyed childlike whimsy put me in this mindset where I was just like, wow, video games are really cool. The percentage bar telling you how much of the level you've colored in also puts me in the mindset of combing over every single bit of a Banjo-Kazooie level looking for the last few notes, which is another effortlessly cozy sensation this game brought me. Newt One took me 3 hours to beat and is available for $10. Despite really only being familiar with Dark Souls 1 myself, the existence of FromSoft games is probably the greatest pressure against me swearing off the AAA games industry altogether. Yes, they've inspired a whole legion of imitators, enough to spawn the god-awful Souls-like term that I hate, but I always thought these kinds of games needed both an extra level of polish that big budgets afford, and a powerful thematic vision beyond just the inherently satisfying combat. Well, apparently I was a doofus jester puddle pantser, because not only does Lucah Born of a Dream exist, it's a total masterpiece, both in its derivative and original elements. The combat has a wonderful rhythm to it. It's a lot more dexterous than a lot of FromSoft combat, but your stamina meter still absolutely determines the pace of the battle. You can still do damage while staying far away to recover stamina by shooting a projectile weapon, but you can only recharge that by getting back into the frenzy and landing melee hits. And in true FromSoft inspiration fashion, there's a ton of different augmentations and upgrades and side grades to help you fine-tune what playstyle you want. All this, plus some other nuances that I'll leave you to find for yourself, makes for possibly my favorite combat I've ever seen in an indie game. I tend towards non-violent games in my indie taste, so maybe that's not saying much, but Lucah is challenging and exhilarating. It's a difficult game that made me really invested in trying to get better at it, which is always a good sign. But what really makes Lucah special is its imagery and its themes. The resonant way it delivers themes is another strength inherited from its FromSoft inspirations, but while, say, Dark Souls delivers its themes through literal events and striking specific imagery, Lucah is surrealist, with a story that's very confusing in terms of actual events, but far less ambiguous in terms of emotions, giving a drifty, dreamy aesthetic to both the visuals and the narrative. I don't want to spoil too much, but it's really hard to miss the heavy-handed religious imagery, the more subtle queer elements strewn throughout, and the overall feeling that we could be exploring the subconscious of a very confused, conflicted, broken person. It really hit close to home for me, but I think there's a lot to appreciate even if it doesn't for you. Lucah, Born of a Dream took me 5 hours to beat and is available for $15, and there are both multiple endings and a more challenging New Game Plus mode that definitely provide a lot of content for the gaping content maw. One of the most interesting experiences I've had in the past few weeks was Walden, a game. Like Henry David Thoreau Walden, like the book, one of the quietest, most introspective pieces of work in the literary canon. They made a game out of it, and that is entirely my vibe. I love game ideas that come from unexpected places. Also, just looking at this game gave me Eastshade vibes, being a pretty non-violent game that seems to be based on exploration. It's not as good as Eastshade, I guess I should make that clear, but it's still an extremely interesting experience. It's basically a combination of light survival elements and occasional delivery quests, neither of which are much on their own as much as they are the glue that holds everything together. The pond itself was designed with what I believe was historical and geographical accuracy in mind, which is an admirable effort, but it also means it feels a little less deliberate and spatially memorable than other open world games. And there's not much of an extrinsic reason to go out of your way into the woods other than to do a quest that amounts to going to a place marked on your map, since fuel and food and shelter can all be found in the area just surrounding your cabin. The motivation to explore then, besides just getting bored with the same surroundings all the time, isn't really related to gameplay at all. You have an inspiration state, and if you keep it high, you'll see arrowheads lying around on the forest floor. If you pick them up, it plays a relevant passage from the actual book, representing Thoreau's introspection and observations. Visiting places and finding arrowheads basically gives you a bit-by-bit audiobook of Walden, and is also clearly encouraging you to think your own thoughts in response to Thoreau's opinions. There are even books lying around the forest, highly abridged versions of texts that were influential on Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Transcendentalist movement in general. You can actually sit down and read a bunch of Confucian nuggets, or a simplified version of Plato's story about the cave. Things like this, the slower-paced parts of the game, the parts that want you to take your time to read and listen and think, are by far the most interesting things the game has to offer, in my opinion. Sadly, these slower, quieter moments often conflict with both the timed nature of the day-night cycle and the constant pressure to keep all your needs in check. In the last couple of hours of the game, when I had increased all my needs to max capacity and didn't need to check on them all the time, I actually sat down and tried to get something out of the books I had previously just skimmed, and letters I had barely read due to feeling up till now that I just didn't have the time. I'm not sure if I would say that the survival elements ought to be dropped altogether, as roughing it and being self-sufficient is such a core idea of the book, but the game is clearly trying to invite contemplation, and I think that would have been much helped by making these systems a little more lenient. I guess also, just to cover my tracks, I don't actually know much about Henry David Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson or any of the other historical people depicted in this game, and the game is very obviously like a very idealized and gleaming portrayal of Thoreau and his experiment. I generally like to have a healthy skepticism of historical figures being idealized, so I don't know. If he was actually a bad dude whose badness has gone unexamined by most literary scholars and this game, you can pass on it if that idealized portrayal makes you uncomfortable. That being said, like when I went to the part of his Wikipedia page marked criticism, I found Nathaniel Hawthorne being annoyed at him for leading a sort of Indian life among civilized men, and Robert Louis Stevenson chastising him for his, and I'm not making this up, womanish solitude. So, that doesn't prove anything, but if anything, it does make me want to give him the benefit of the doubt more, maybe. But regardless, even if Thoreau didn't earn the idealized portrayal that this game gives him, it spends just as much, if not more time on his broad ideas as on the specifics of his life, and the way that the game communicates those ideas, despite some flaws, is genuinely admirable and ambitious. I'd recommend giving it a look. Walden, a game, took me 7 hours to beat, and it's available for the base price of $18.45, but is currently on sale for $4.61, which is kind of a steal, so yeah. I'm really bad at puzzle games, and I generally don't find myself buying or playing them, but even though I sucked at it, it was nice every once in a while to come back to adjacency to keep my brain occupied for a few minutes. You click on colored shapes to fill in all the shapes adjacent to it with that color, with the general goal of getting the colors filling the shapes to match the borders, and it only gets more complicated from there. Like I said, I'm really bad at it and not the best person to talk to about puzzle games in general, but it's a really neat concept done very well, and if you're hankering for something to stimulate your logistical brain to keep you from losing it completely, I'd highly recommend it. I, shockingly, did not beat adjacency, but it seems to have a good amount of content for its $3 price. I love Psychonauts. It's one of my favorite games, as is documented on this channel, so whenever something gives me Psychonauts vibes, however broad, it immediately catches my interest. Granted, in Tim Schafer terms, Smile for me probably has more in common with his LucasArts point-and-click adventures than anything else, but any game where you go around listening to the woes of a quirky cast of characters and then help them out is just always gonna have that association for me. Smile for me is a first-person adventure game, and I don't know how many games exist like this, but if there's not a subgenre of this kind of game, there should be. It has many of the same elements of point-and-click game, you know, using every item on everything, trying to decode what the person is requesting, that kind of stuff, but it takes full advantage of it existing in 3D in a way that makes it both extremely unique and extremely fun to interact with. It also has a lot of really resonant thematic stuff, which is always kind of my bread and butter. Without spoiling it, it's a game about how we perceive and respond to unhappiness in those around us, and its true ending is a culmination of our ability to recognize and do our best to tend to the pain in others. Also, the music slaps, which is always a plus. Smile for me took me 3 hours to beat and is available for $13. Finally, I want to talk a small bit about Verdant Skies. It's one of those Harvest Moon type games that are becoming even more popular in the wake of Stardew Valley. There's a lot of these games out now, but this one sticks out to me because, well, firstly, it just looks really nice. I love the art. You also don't get a gender option when making your character and are thus not limited in your customization. This idea was also used in a recent, much more popular game, but Verdant Skies is from 2018, so you know what? Howling Moon Software ran so Nintendo could walk. It's also got a really cool setting. These games generally try to embrace comfort through the quiet, rural, small town aesthetic, but Verdant Skies pulls off a similar coziness out of a sci-fi setting where some colonists try to tame the uncaring wilderness of an uninhabited planet. It's neat. I haven't gotten very far into this game, but dating options are also there if you're into that, and since you don't pick a gender, that's not a limiting factor, which is pretty cool. I've only spent a bit of time with Verdant Skies, and there's clearly a whole lot of content in it. It even has its own big ol' wiki. I'm definitely not in the place to give it a comprehensive review, but if you're like me and enjoy these kinds of games, you'll probably fall for it as quickly as I did. Sometimes just having a stable, cozy routine with just enough fun little events and bits of dialogue and changing plans to make the days feel distinct is just the best feeling ever. And if there's anything I can say, even with my very limited experience with this game so far, it's that I think it does that balance really well. I have not beaten Verdant Skies, even if it does have an ending, but in terms of pure content, it really does rival pretty much every other game in this video, and you can pick it up for $20. Okay, so that's 15-ish games of varying price and content and style. Hopefully you thought one of them looked cool. Support indie devs if you can. It's a hard time for lots of creative people right now. itch.io even lets you leave a tip on free games, which is something that I recommend doing, especially if you ended up enjoying the game. And, you know, y'all stay safe. What does womanish solitude mean? Robert, what does it mean? What are you talking